The Submission of Nomos, an essay on the Physis Nomos debate and distinction. The word Physis is a Greek word, and I am not entirely sure how to pronounce it, so I will be referring to it as Physis for the duration of the essay. The Submission of Nomos. When one is of age and of mind, a particular point in both space and time is identified. It is from this point that one achieves an understanding that they have cemented, for the time being, a semi-permanent link in the causal chain that contains all causal chains. Most will never arrive at this particular point. Most will never become of age and of mind, but this we will not critique for the time being. These words are for you and you alone, who claim to be of age and of mind. Once one arrives at this particular point in space and time, the first action one must do is to truly and honestly ask a question: what should I do? What should I be doing? How should I live? This, above all, is the only foundation by which one may stand on his feet and rightfully declare that it is his 2 feet alone that he stands upon. As one will come to know, if they truly are of age and of mind, that any man with his own 2 feet will always stand upon the earth, from which he and all others have sprouted forth from. Hence, no man ever truly stands alone. No man may conquer the moon, the sun, the solar system, and expect his essence to achieve some construct of higher state or being. For man is subject to, and already and always in submission to, nature. Man cannot conquer nature without annihilating himself. Those who are of age and of mind understand that nature is and always will be superior to man. Thus, it is nature that man will always stand upon and submit to. The thesis of this paper is to identify the distinction between nature and man, and to assert that man, always in submission to nature, must create social systems that reflect this submission to nature and are in accordance with this submission to nature. Just as man cannot debate his way out of a need for oxygen and water, man cannot debate his way out of the social systems he was born into. He may identify his submission to the social systems he was born into, but this does not automatically exclude him from his submission. To anyone that doubts this assertion, claiming to not be in submission to the social systems, what language do you think in, and where do you think that came from? It may be understood in this paper the idea of man's embeddedness within both nature and human-made social systems. Theoretical work to consider as a stepping stone to a more elaborate framework would involve dissecting this relation of human-made social systems and evolutionary processes. Moral equilibriums can likely have said to be created in response to environmental selection pressures. Different systems of morality may have been understood as different in their particulars. But generally speaking, in referring to many years ago, likely due to the advent of early language, the moral systems created were likely systems that were derived from the predicament that man was in. In the early times, this predicament was exclusively caused by nature and nature alone. But this extended concept we will save for another time or for someone else to uncover. The formal thesis is that human beings and civilizations can live coherently and avoid self-annihilation only if law, convention, and social systems are explicitly subordinate to nature, which includes biological reality and the set of conditions of existence. When human-made laws, conventions, and systems are treated as primary or autonomous, individuals and civilizations elevate death to have a higher status than life. The question of suicide. Nature created man, and man still depends on nature for processes by which man has no control over. The multitude of processes occurring each second in man's body are not unfolding by the mind of man, but by millions of years of nature doing what nature does. And man surely has zero agency in ensuring our dear moon stays where it is, and that our Mother Earth continues its orbit around our source of seemingly never-ending energy, which is the sun. Recent scientific advancement may lead one to believe we now have some sense of control over these various biological processes, but do not be deceived. Yes, we have made significant advancements in our understanding and in our models, but one who is of age and of mind surely understands that models and our understanding of reality are different than reality itself. Refined models allow for extended engineering practices or perhaps a more holistic interpretation of existence. However, it is easily understood that despite the majority of individuals not understanding why they need to drink water, they inherently know that they need to drink water. In a sense, this is how existence and evolutionary selection pressures operate, without going too much into the details at this particular moment. Existence signals to us what we need to do, and nowhere does it require us to fully understand why it is that existence is signaling this. To question why existence would be signaling anything is the same as saying that you know better than existence. Who are we to challenge existence in the first place? Further, we can identify that nature is this feedback generating system whereby pain, exhaustion, hunger, anxiety are examples of corrective signals that the individual is given and that they may or may not interpret, integrate, or fully reject. To reject this corrective signal means to reject nature. It means to reject existence and reality for what it truly is and not for what we want it to be. This, above all, is not recommended and surely ends in pain, annihilation, and surely in death. Some of the claimed to be wise men of our ancestral past conclude that the master is dependent on the slave and that the slave is not dependent on the master. And it may feel right to conclude that nature is our master and that it is dependent on us, but do not be confused. Nature is our master, but she not only controls from without, she also controls from within. Without our bondage to her, we simply cease to exist. To claim we are greater than the external and internal processes we are ubiquitously and always in submission to neglects the predicament we are faced with. Understanding this submission leads us to understand why our ancestors spent extended amounts of energy trying to understand the relationship between nature and man, and how it is that we are supposed to conduct ourselves with respect to this relationship. This is the fundamental question of how should we live. Inherent in this fundamental question of man first implies that one believes they should be living at all. As Camus rightly asserts, the first question of philosophy amounts to whether or not one thinks life is worth living. How should we live has claimed ownership as the fundamental question of philosophy and of human affairs. But preceding this question is, should I be living at all? This, dear friends, is the fundamental question, and one must answer. It may even be understood that philosophy, broadly understood, as simply a fractal recursive loop of continuing to ask the question of suicide and its implications. It does not matter whether you consciously answer this question with words and speech. Jumping to the assumed fundamental question of how should I live has already implied that the answer to the first question of should I be living at all is definitively answered yes. It may seem insignificant to clarify such things, but it must be understood. These are matters of life and death, and one who claims to be of age and of mind surely will acknowledge their capacity to question the validity of being alive at all. Only once one has answered this first question earnestly and truthfully may they begin to contemplate what their options are regarding how it is that they should be living. But again, for one to contemplate how they should be living has already asserted with absolute certainty that they should in fact continue living in the first place. If nothing else in this paper gives you hope, and if nothing else in this world gives you hope, let it be known this fact I have just stated. The world may seem doom and gloom, but fundamentally, at the very core, and perhaps only at the local level of not committing direct suicide of one's body, the vast majority of humans on this earth do not choose death. They choose life. Their answer to the fundamental question of should I be living at all is answered with absolute certainty and resoundingly as yes. If the vast majority of individuals choose life over death at this very local individual level, why is it that then on a global scale we appear only to see doom and gloom and death? More on this to come. But the simple answer is that the logical conclusions of answering yes to whether or not life is worth living needs to be extended to all life and all of existence. Many will not commit direct suicide of their individual bodies, but they do not continue asking this question on an upward trajectory regarding the nested systems that they are dependent upon and embedded within. Yes, they may not kill themselves and kill their body, but if a system that they depend upon dies because they were not taking care of it adequately, then they too will die. This is a form of indirect suicide. The question of should I be living is a question first about whether one should commit direct suicide of their body. Is life worth living at all? Would it be better to be dead? But further, one must then ask, should my family be alive? Should my community be alive? Should my society be alive? Should the earth be alive? Should the existence as a whole continue to exist? We will see in further detail, and perhaps in a second paper, that what some call the meta-crisis, otherwise known as the doom and gloom and death, for the cause of doom and gloom and death of our current civilization, can stem back to most individuals answering these questions in favor of death and or answering these questions in favor of life, but proceeding to behave and act in a way that favors death. The Nietzschean criteria states that one must practice what they preach, and this is a failure of the Nietzschean criteria in its most heinous manifestation. What this reveals is that suicide need not occur at the level of conscious intent in order to be real. It may instead be distributed across scales emergent from misalignment rather than chosen outright. A system can appear stable, even flourishing, at one level while simultaneously eroding the conditions of its own continuation at another. Individuals may optimize for immediate survival, comfort, or psychological relief, while the institutions they inhabit optimize for abstraction, efficiency, or metric success. Yet nowhere in this arrangement is there a mechanism tasked with preserving long-term regeneration across the nested systems that all local optimizations depend upon and are embedded within. Life is affirmed in fragments and denied in totality. In such a configuration, collapse does not require hatred of life or existence. It requires only, or even despair. It requires only the absence of orientation. Suicide here is not an act, but a destruction. Suicide here is not an act, but a structure. Death is not willed, but produced as an unintended consequence of systems that mistake short-term viability for sanity and confuse momentary stability or models of life with life itself. Our ancestors spent large amounts of energy questioning the assumed fundamental question of how should we live. But many neglected to see the inherent implications in viewing this as the fundamental question. The Physis Nomos debate can be used as a clarifying tool in how our ancestors view these particular problems and questions. Physis may be understood as the origin, the birth, and natural form of man and of nature itself. Nomos, on the other hand, is to deal out or to dispense, otherwise known as the man-made conventions of law and custom. Physis, as others have argued and how I will argue it, is the universal essence of existence. Nomos is local and contingent to a specific time and place. Assuming one has answered in the affirmative that first question of whether one should be living at all, we can now arrive at the second question in an epistemologically sound fashion. To affirm life at any scale above the level of the individual requires more than intention. It requires orientation within constraint. Every living system exists within boundaries it did not choose. Energetic limits, temporal finitude, material dependency. The living system survives not by negating these constraints, but by operating intelligently within them. Nature establishes the space of what is possible, and human systems merely select among those possibilities. When optimization is mistaken for liberation and efficiency is mistaken for wisdom, systems begin to treat constraints as errors to be corrected rather than conditions to be respected. Yet optimization detached from constraint does not produce freedom. It produces instability, which, over enough time, produces whatever the opposite of the assumed freedom actually is. Laws, norms, and institutions that deny or obscure natural limits may achieve short-term gains, but they do so by borrowing against the future. In such cases, collapse is not the result of external shock, but of internal contradiction, a system accelerating precisely because it no longer knows where it must stop. The question of how one should live cannot be answered by mere preference or inherited custom. It demands an account of what is prior, grounding, and not of our own making. This is where the distinction between Physis and Nomos becomes decisive and of absolute importance. Physis names the order of nature, what is, what governs what is, the limits of that which is and that which governs what is. Nomos names law, convention, custom, and social agreement. Human life unfolds within Nomos, but it does not originate there. Any attempt to answer how we should live that begins and ends with convention and Nomos mistakes a secondary structure for a foundational one. Physis is superior to Nomos because it establishes the conditions of possibility for any meaningful normativity at all. Human beings are not blank slates upon which laws arbitrarily inscribe value. We are embodied, temporal, vulnerable beings whose life depends on certain universal features of the Physis. Hunger, mortality, reproduction, cognition, and social dependence are not conventions, and yet they exert normative force. A way of life that systematically violates these natural constraints produces disease and pathology rather than health. A violation may occur through excess, repression, or rejection. Physis therefore functions as a measure. It reveals what a human being is and thus what a human being can reasonably do and become. Nomos, by contrast, is necessary but subordinate to Physis. Because human beings are not solitary animals, nature alone is insufficient to coordinate action, distribute responsibility, or preserve stability across generations. Laws, customs, and institutions translate natural needs into durable forms. Yet when Nomos detaches itself from Physis, it becomes self-referential and ultimately tyrannical. Convention then no longer serves life, but demands that life conform to its own internal logic, whether it be economic, bureaucratic, or ideological, any kind. In such cases, obedience to law ceases to be a pathway for a life aligned with existence and instead becomes a mechanism of alienation, annihilation, pathology, and death. To say that Nomos must submit to Physis is not to advocate anarchy or a return to brute instinct. Rather, it is to insist that laws and norms be intelligible as responses to real human needs rather than as ends in themselves. Because most people necessarily live in submission to Nomos, aligning it with Physis will then allow law and Nomos to function as an indirect submission to nature. When institutions reward excellence appropriate to human capacities, restrain excess, and acknowledge natural limits, they guide individuals toward lives that are coherent rather than conflicted. The alternative is a society in which people obey rules that systematically contradict their own nature, producing resentment, hypocrisy, or despair. Thus, the question, how should we live, finds its answer neither in raw nature nor in unexamined convention, but in their proper ordering. We should live in accordance with Physis, using reason to discern the conditions of human life, and employ Nomos as a tool for stabilizing and transmitting that insight across the scales of all the nested systems of existence. A good life, on this view, is not one that merely follows the rules, nor one that rejects them outright, but one in which law is transparent to nature, where obedience educates rather than distorts. Only under this hierarchy can human life take a trajectory away from complete annihilation and catastrophe or dystopia. What does submission to Physis require of the individual? To say that Physis is superior to Nomos is not merely to make a metaphysical claim. It is to specify a functional demand placed upon the individual. Physis is not an abstraction to be admired at a distance, nor a set of ideals to be selectively invoked. It asserts itself continuously through the operating conditions of embodied existence, the limits of the body, the finitude of time, and the inevitability of death. These are not negotiable features of life, nor are they moral failures or injustices. They are boundary conditions. Every living system exists within constraints it did not choose, and persists not by denying them, but by operating coherently within them. Submission to Physis therefore begins with the recognition of constraint as the precondition of life, rather than an obstacle to freedom. Fatigue cannot be argued away. Hunger cannot be legislated out of existence, and no amount of ideology can exempt a body from decay and death. When a system exceeds its limits, costs are incurred automatically. The individual who refuses this reality does not transcend nature. He repeatedly overloads the system until breakdown becomes inevitable. What appears as resistance to limitation is, in practice, a refusal to adapt to the conditions that make persistence and existence possible at all. Yet Physis is not only constraint, it must also be orientation. Within the boundaries imposed by embodiment and finitude, living systems exhibit discernible trajectories of capacity and degradation. Strength, resilience, competence, and coherence increase through sustained engagement with manageable stress, while they deteriorate through prolonged avoidance, excess, or misalignment. These gradients are not cultural inventions or moral projections. They are empirically observable patterns. Muscles strengthen through resistance, attention sharpens through sustained effort, and character stabilizes through repeated confrontation with difficulty. Submission to Physis therefore requires orienting one's life toward processes that increase systemic capacity across the scales of all nested systems, rather than those that merely reduce short-term discomfort. Drift, stagnation, and the pursuit of comfort at the expense of development are not neutral states. They are movements against the conditions under which living systems remain viable. Physis also functions as the deepest feedback-generating system. It does not judge, punish, or reward in the moralistic sense preferred by Nomos. It responds. Pain, exhaustion, illness, psychological fragmentation, and even social breakdown are not condemnations, but signals. They arise when demands exceed capacity, when perception diverges from reality, or when corrective information is ignored. In complex systems, feedback intensifies when unheeded. Suppressing or moralizing these signals does not restore alignment. It delays the correction while increasing the severity of the inevitable failure and annihilation. Submission to Physis therefore requires the humility to interpret suffering, not merely as misfortune, but as information about the state of a system. To treat symptoms while protecting the cause is to preserve instability under the mask of relief. From this, it follows the necessity of rejecting self-deception. Self-deception is not merely a personal vice, it is a functional violation of Physis. To misrepresent one's capacities, motivations, or limits is to interfere with the feedback mechanisms that make adaptation possible. In any system, the suppression of accurate feedback does not produce stability, it produces fragility. Nature cannot be deceived. It responds only to what is enacted, not to what is believed or declared. Submission to Physis therefore requires disciplined honesty, not as a moral ideal, but as a practical requirement for maintaining orientation and coherence over time. Without such honesty, no meaningful adjustment can occur, and no sustained action can be aligned with reality. Discipline, on this view, is not oppression, but self-regulation. Modern sensibilities often interpret discipline as the imposition of nomos upon an otherwise free self. Yet the self that resists discipline is not free at all. It is disordered. Discipline is the practice by which attention, effort, and behavior are brought into coherence with the constraints and demands of existence. Regular sleep, training, intellectual rigor are not arbitrary restrictions. They are stabilizing processes that reduce volatility and expand developmental capacity. What appears as restriction in the short term becomes freedom in the long term, because a well-regulated system can endure more, adapt more effectively, and act with greater range and precision. Alignment with Physis does not narrow life, it makes sustained and meaningful life possible. The inversion of Physis as subordinate. If the claim that Nomos must submit to Physis is to be more than a personal orientation, it must be contrasted against the dominant alternatives that deny this hierarchy in practice. The present age is not neutral with respect to the Physis-Nomos distinction and debate. It has resolved the question implicitly through its institutional and cultural systems. That resolution treats Nomos not as a translation of natural constraint, but as a substitute for it. Functionally, Nomos has taken the place of superiority over Physis, claiming it can retain Physis as its subordinate, conquering and manipulating it as needed. The prevailing assumption is that human beings can define themselves, their values, and their limits independently of any prior natural order. This assumption now functions less as a contested claim and more as an unexamined axiom embedded in the system. One expression of this inversion appears in radical constructivism, the view that values and norms are entirely socially produced and therefore indefinitely malleable. On this account, appeals to human nature are treated with suspicion, not because they are empirically false, but because they introduce constraints. Yet denying Physis does not eliminate constraint. It merely obscures its source. Biological, psychological, and ecological limits continue to operate regardless of whether or not they are acknowledged. When social systems are designed as though such limits are optional or negotiable, corrective feedback emerges elsewhere, in declining health, attentional fragmentation, demographic instability, and the erosion of social cohesion. The contradiction is structural rather than ideological. Constructivism claims liberation from natural constraint while remaining entirely dependent on the stable functioning of the very processes it refuses to recognize. A second manifestation of this inversion appears in technocratic instrumentalism, which treats human beings and societies as systems to be optimized, managed, and recalibrated. This worldview does not deny Physis outright. Instead, it reduces it to raw material to be manipulated rather than a constraint to be respected. Human beings are rendered objects of intervention rather than subjects with inherent form and limited tolerance for redesign. In privileging efficiency, predictability, and control, technocratic systems absolutize Nomos in its most procedural form, rules without orientation and metrics without any meaning. Yet the complexity of biological, psychological, and social systems consistently exceeds the models designed to manage them. When feedback is filtered to fit predefined metrics, systems become brittle. Attempts to impose control at scale often increase the volatility rather than resilience, producing cascading failures that appear sudden only because corrective signals were suppressed. Postmodern skepticism of universals further entrenches this inversion by undermining the possibility of shared standards grounded in Physis. Truth, meaning, and value are reframed as contingent products of language, power, or identity, rather than as partial but necessary approximations of reality. While this skepticism successfully exposes the arrogance of certain imposed norms of Nomos, it overcorrects by dissolving all non-arbitrary grounding. The result is not pluralism, but complete uncertainty and indeterminacy. When no standards can claim correspondence with reality, Nomos loses its orienting function. Laws and conventions persist, but they float free of any shared criteria for correction. In such conditions, coordination gives way to procedural dominance, popularity, or the monopoly of force. This is so because no other mechanism remains for resolving disagreement. Nihilism. Nihilistic individualism represents the existential endpoint of this trajectory. Having severed itself from Physis and grown distrustful of shared norms, the individual is left as the sole locus of meaning. Choice itself becomes detached from consequence, coherence, or capacity. Yet this form of autonomy proves unsustainable at the level of lived experience. Meaning cannot be generated in isolation. nor can it be sustained without engagement with the structures that both preceded it and will outlive the individual's lifespan. When orientation is reduced to preference and responsibility is dissolved into abstraction, the individual system becomes completely unstable. What appears as freedom initially manifests over time as fragmentation, exhaustion, and despair. The collapse here is not moral, but functional. A system deprived of external orientation loses the capacity to regulate itself. What unites these positions is not malice, but misplacement. Each elevates nomos, whether social consensus, technical procedure, interpretive framework, or personal preference, into an absolute. In doing so, each treats physis not as the ground of normativity, but as an inconvenience to be bypassed, redefined, or ignored. Yet physis does not disappear when excluded from theory or design. It is still there, and it reasserts itself through the system behavior. Psychological distress, social fragmentation, ecological degradation, and existential disorientation are not anomalies within these worldviews. They are predictable outcomes of systems that suppress or misinterpret feedback. To identify these positions is not to condemn them outright, but to recognize that any attempt to answer the question, how should we live, while excluding physis, has already undermined its own coherence and excluded itself from being a viable answer to the question. Civilizational suicide and the denial of physis. The question of suicide, as Camus rightly insisted, is the fundamental philosophical problem. Yet Camus' framing remains largely confined to the individual. What has been insufficiently examined is the possibility that civilizations, like individuals, can and should answer the suicide question, though not always consciously, and perhaps never at all. And rarely all at once, and never all at once. A society may overwhelmingly choose life at the level of individual bodies while simultaneously organizing itself in ways that negate its own continuation. In such cases, suicide does not appear as a dramatic act, but as a structural orientation. Life is affirmed locally and individually, but denied globally and systemically. This distinction clarifies an otherwise perplexing feature of the modern world. Most individuals do not seek their own immediate death and destruction. They work, plan, reproduce, and hope. Yet the aggregate effect of their participation in prevailing institutions is the gradual erosion of the conditions that make those individual lives coherent and sustainable. Families weaken, birth rates decline, communities fragment, ecosystems degrade, and shared purpose completely dissipates. These outcomes are not anomalies or moral failures. They are the predictable results of systems whose governing logic no longer translates the constraints and requirements of physis into stabilized forms. A civilization can therefore affirm life rhetorically while selecting for death structurally. At this scale, policies, incentives, and norms function as distributed answers to the suicide question. A society that systemically discourages reproduction, treats human beings as interchangeable inputs, severs effort from reward, and dissolves responsibility into abstraction has already specified its trajectory. No explicit desire for destruction or death is required. The orientation is encoded in feedback loops, incentive structures, and institutional design. Individuals may continue to choose life in isolation, but the larger system steadily exhausts its capacity to regenerate and will die. Civilizational suicide in this sense does not require violence or intent. It occurs when continued existence becomes increasingly improbable under the system's own operating system. Here, the previously identified antagonists reveal their deeper function. Radical constructivism, technocratic instrumentalism, postmodern skepticism, and nihilistic individualism, just to name a few, are not merely competing theories. They function as civilizational design logics. Each minimizes or denies physis as a source of constraint and normativity, elevating nomos through social consensus, technical control, interpretive fluidity, or personal preference. In doing so, each removes any non-arbitrary standard by which life-supporting structures can be evaluated or preserved. What remains are systems that manage activity without sustaining meaning, permit choice without providing orientation, and generate critique without maintaining responsibility. A civilization that undermines its own capacity to regenerate and sustain itself biologically, psychologically, ecologically, or culturally fails regardless of its ethical language or technical sophistication. To affirm life is not merely to avoid immediate collapse, but to maintain the conditions under which life can continue, deepen, and justify itself across generations. A nomos severed from physis may prolong motion and movement, but it cannot sustain viability. It may optimize subsystems, but it cannot preserve a future that is worth inheriting. Physis thus emerges as a diagnostic standard for civilizational sanity. A sane civilization recognizes limits, maintains generational continuity, and aligns its institutions with the realities of human embodiment, dependency, and development. An insane civilization attempts to legislate its way out of these realities, treating biological, psychological, and ecological constraints as problems to be engineered away rather than conditions to be integrated. The contemporary meta-crisis is best understood in these terms, not as a failure of intelligence or technological capacity, but as the cumulative outcome of a civilization that affirms life ambiguously at the individual level while selecting against it at the level of system design. If civilizations, like individuals, implicitly answer the question of whether they should continue to exist, then some standard must exist by which those answers can be evaluated. Without such a standard, the distinction between flourishing and decay collapses into preference, and the language of crisis completely loses its meaning. Physis provides this standard. It does not act as moral authority in the judicial sense, but it acts as the irreducible ground against which claims about progress, freedom, and advancement can be tested. A civilization is sane insofar as its structures remain intelligible in terms of the conditions that make human life possible and sustainable at all. The first criterion of civilizational sanity is biological and generational continuity. A viable civilization reproduces itself not only numerically, but functionally, through the transmission of competence, responsibility, and orientation across generations. This is a basic requirement of system persistence. When a society treats reproduction as optional, burdensome, or irrational, it signals a failure to maintain the conditions of its own renewal. This failure need not involve hostility toward life. Indifference is enough. A system that cannot project itself a future it regards as worth inhabiting has already withdrawn its commitment to continued existence, regardless of the technological capacity or ethical vocabulary. The second criterion is alignment between effort, competence, and reward. In a sane civilization, positions of responsibility and authority emerge from demonstrated capacity and sustained contribution, rather than from abstraction, manipulation, or purely procedural legitimacy. This alignment reflects a fundamental property of living systems. Capacity increases through effort applied over time under constraint. When institutional structures sever effort from outcome, they disrupt the feedback mechanisms that motivate development and coordination. The result is not stability or justice, but resentment, disengagement, and systemic restlessness or polarization. A third criterion is the ability to interpret suffering as signal rather than as something to dismiss as unnecessary. Sane civilizations recognize that pain, failure, and limitation are not anomalies to be eliminated indiscriminately, but sources of information about misalignment between system demands and system capacity. While unnecessary suffering should be reduced, the categorical rejection of discomfort as intolerable reflects a refusal to process feedback. When a society treats all friction as pathology, it loses the capacity to correct itself. Living systems adapt through resistance. Civilizations that suppress or reject this feedback become blind to their own instability and accelerate their own deterioration. The fourth criterion is epistemic humility with respect to the complexity of existence. A sane civilization understands that its models, measurements, and institutions are approximations rather than replacements for reality. The Tao that is spoken is not the eternal Tao. It distinguishes between representation and control. When Nomos claims exhaustive authority over systems it only partially understands, it obviously becomes brittle. Feedback is filtered, uncertainty is denied, and corrective signals arrive only in amplified form. Collapse, when it occurs, appears sudden only because gradual misalignment was systematically ignored. Sanity consists not in mastery, but in restraint, informed by the awareness of the limits and constraints of existence. Finally, a sane civilization maintains a coherent relationship between meaning and responsibility. Meaning does not arise arbitrarily, nor can it be generated through preference alone. It emerges where individuals are entrusted with responsibilities that matter beyond their immediate self-interest and beyond a single lifespan. When responsibility is dissolved into systems and procedures, or meaning is reduced to subjective choice, both evaporate. Physis binds meaning to participation in processes that exceed the individual, generational continuity, shared competence, and the maintenance of the conditions for life. A civilization that severs this bond produces individuals who are formally free, but functionally unmoored. These criteria do not prescribe a particular political system, economic model, or cultural form. They merely establish the conditions under which such forms can remain viable. To fail these criteria is not to commit an error in judgment, but to exhibit a form of collective disorientation through a loss of contact with the conditions of its own existence. Whether such a civilization can recover is a separate question. What can be said with certainty is this: without Physis as its measure, Nomos cannot distinguish sanity from madness, and it confuses life with death.